10 people who were killed in an apparently racist attack on Saturday. Police have described the 18-year-old suspect in the supermarket shooting, Peyton Gendron, as demented. 11 of the 13 people who were shot in the attack were black. The Queen has made a surprise appearance at Paddington Station in West London today to see the new Elizabeth line, which was previously known as Crossrail. Her Majesty carried out the rare public engagement, having missed the state opening of Parliament last week because of mobility issues. Well, now, it's been the last bastion of defence in Mariupol after weeks of Russian siege and bombardment, and today more than 260 Ukrainian soldiers have been evacuated from the Azovstal steel plant in the ruined city. Ukrainian officials said the soldiers are heroes who changed the course of the war after they kept Russian forces at bay for 82 days in the labyrinth of bunkers and tunnels below the steelworks. Well, Russia is continuing its push in eastern Ukraine. There have been heavy bombardments across the Donbas region in the last 24 hours. Significant fighting is currently taking place in Luhansk and Donetsk, but strong resistance from Ukrainian troops is slowing Russia's progress once again. And as you've been hearing, overnight more than 260 Ukrainian soldiers left the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol after an 82-day battle. The evacuation of soldiers has effectively given Russia control of that port city. The soldiers were taken in buses to Russian-controlled areas. The wounded were taken to a hospital in the city of Novoazovsk, while more than 200 are believed to have been taken to the town of Olenivka. Meanwhile, Ukrainian troops have reached the Russian border after successfully pushing Russian forces away from the country's second city of Kharkiv. Well, that sets the scene then for your questions right now. As we've been telling you, our security and defence analyst, Professor Michael Clarke, is here to go through them. And some of the first questions, Michael, of course, concern the situation in Mariupol. Let's start with JT's question. And JT says Russia now effectively has control of Mariupol, as we've been seeing on the map, including the Azovstal steel plant. How does this impact the war strategically? What change does it make?
Well, it gives the Russians a chance to release some of the troops that they've been using around the Azovstal steelworks. In truth, they've had Mariupol now for a few weeks. But this Azovstal issue is very bad for them symbolically, and they tied up troops trying to do something about it. It would have been more sensible, to be honest, for the Russians to have allowed this humanitarian gesture weeks ago to take it off the board, instead of which it's done them a lot of harm in terms of general world opinion. And these troops down inside the Azovstal steelworks, they were never going to be bombed out because that was a Soviet-era complex which was made with nuclear bomb shelters. So they were never going to bomb them out. They couldn't starve them out because they obviously had reasonable food stocks. And any commander would have been stupid to send his own troops down into the tunnels after them. That would have been a massacre of Russian troops. So the best thing they could have done to take it off the table was to offer them free passage out and all the rest of it. But they stuck to this Russian plan of destroying them in Azovstal. They didn't succeed. So now at the 11th hour, there has been some humanitarian gesture. Good for them. It takes it away from the battle moves forward now. The Russians need all these troops further north, where they are short of troops in this big offensive in the Donbas region.
Well, let's talk about the Russian bona fides. As you say, a humanitarian gesture, or is it? Well, this question comes from Sharon. Sharon asks, how can Azov fighters' safety be guaranteed in Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine? How can they trust Russia will release them in a prisoner exchange, for example? How will they treat those wounded soldiers, and in particular these 260 who've been taken out of Azovstal? I spoke to a member of the battalion, the Azov battalion, in that steelworks last week, and said, I mentioned the whole idea of some kind of humanitarian deal. He said, well, we know what the Russians think of us, how they term us. We don't trust them. Can we trust that these soldiers will be put into safe care, the wounded will be treated, and those that aren't will be treated under the Hague Convention?
Well, I think we should pay tribute here to the tireless work of the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the United Nations. They have been talking for ages, secretly or privately, with the Russians and the Ukrainian government and the Azovstal people. And this has gone on and on and on below the surface in trying to get something arranged. And these are very brave people. They're on the ground. They're in a war zone, UN and ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross staff. And what they've done is arrange this with a prisoner exchange. The Ukrainians hold quite a lot of Russian prisoners. The Russians want to get their prisoners back. And that's a sort of mutual hostage situation. So they're saying, you know, we will release your prisoners if you release ours in good condition, that is, you know, without any abuse. And these Ukrainians, they've got to rely on the supervision, I'm guessing, of the ICRC and the UN staff. They will have to look to see that this exchange is conducted without abuse on either side. On either side. I mean, the Ukrainians have abused some of their prisoners, and we've seen it. Not widely, but they have done it. And so they've got to rely on these very brave members of the international community to fix this very carefully choreographed exchange.
I mean, do you know what it put me in mind of, you know, going way back to the Balkans conflict, Srebrenica, and we saw that population, the men and the young teenagers being separated, put on coaches under the eyes of the United Nations. And we were told by the Serbs they were going to have safe passage.
That's right. It didn't have 8,000. 8,000 were killed. And the Dutch who were there at Srebrenica, they stood, but there was nothing. They said there was nothing they could do because they thought it was the best outcome. And you know, the Dutch have been beating themselves up about that ever since.
Well, let's ask more about the situation now in Mariupol, how it's changed. And this from Hamza saying now the soldiers have been evacuated. Has Ukraine fully given up the defence of the city? Well, as you say, they pretty much had already. It was just this holdout. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, Mariupol is gone as far as the Ukrainians are concerned for now. The Ukrainians are under pressure around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Those are the two places they've now got to safeguard, and Severodonetsk, which is now the focus of the battle further north in the Donbas. And that Donbas battle is building because the Russians are still bringing in more forces. The Russians have still got more to put into it, which they will put into it, because they've only got one direction in which they can go now, which is more troops, more equipment, more push. So the Ukrainians have got to give up on Mariupol. However, I note that President Zelensky, in his cheeky, chappy sort of statesmanship, said, of course, we will host the Eurovision Song Contest next year, since we were the winners this year, and we'll host it in Mariupol. Why not?
Indeed. Well, let's hope so. Continuing with this is about the strategy then. How does the final fall of Mariupol, how does it affect things? As say from Matt, Russia has taken this land bridge and secured Mariupol. Can you see a situation where the Russians refocus on this as their main objective rather than attempting to take the whole Donbas region? So they have that land bridge now from Russia itself all the way through to Crimea.
They have, yeah. It's possible they can do one of the two, but not both at the moment. I mean, they are seriously short of troops, and I think we may talk about that a little bit later. But effectively, what they're doing is taking smaller and smaller cuts at the Donbas. This began in a much more grand way, that they're going to draw a line, it seemed, from Kharkiv in the north right through to Mariupol. And that line has gone further and further east. They're taking smaller bites out of this big salient where 40% of Ukrainian forces are. So in a way, they can consolidate in the Donbas, or they can try to consolidate in the so-called this land bridge from Mariupol to Crimea. And they would like it to go past Crimea, of course, as far as Mykolaiv and ultimately Odessa. But that's looking like a very far distant project at the moment. So I'd say they could do it, but my guess is they'll concentrate on Donbas because President Putin has said it. It's the rationale for what they want to do to protect the Russian speakers in the Donbas, is what they say, from Ukrainian government persecution. And unless they're seen to do that in some meaningful way, which really means taking Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, if they take those two cities, then the Donbas looks as if it belongs to the Russians. That's what they'll need to do. OK,
well, that sets up this next question from Jeremy about, I suppose, the shape, the form of the battle that may take place there in Donbas. And the one that already seems was going to happen. Jeremy, ourselves, the Russians were forced to retreat from the north of Kiev. We were told they would regroup to concentrate on the Donbas. Analysts predicted large-scale tank battles on the eastern plains. What actually happened to those? That's a very good question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there were tank battles, but they weren't the sort that people thought about. I mean, this is not so far away from Kursk, which was the greatest tank battle in military history, or the worst tank battle in the Second World War between German tanks and Russian tanks. And that was tank versus tank, you know, the Soviet T-34s against the German Panzers and so on. And that literally was a sort of a battle of crusader tanks against each other. This has been a tank battle. Most of the equipment that's been lost on both sides are tanks, but it's not tank for tank. It's tank versus aerial systems.
Drones and
artillery, anti-tank weapons in the case of Ukrainians, and aircraft. And so it is a tank battle, but not quite in that Kursk Second World War.
But it was also thought, Michael, the terrain was different.
Yeah.
North of Kiev, you've got the wooded
That's right.
areas, the marshes. Is it more open plains and fields?
Well, parts of it are, but you've also got the Donetsk River and all its tributaries and lots of lakes. So there's an awful lot of water there. And in general, what you've got is that the Russians are, by and large, on the east of the Donetsk River, and the Ukrainians are on the west. And that gives them both quite good defensive positions. But, of course, defensive positions are no good to the Russians. And one of the things in military psychology is that when units get into a good defensive position, it's quite hard to get them to move out. For obvious reasons, you can order them out, but they're rather slow to move out of a good defensive position. But my goodness, they're pretty quick to move away from a vulnerable position. I mean, it's basic human nature. So the river that sort of snakes all the way through the Donbas is a major determining factor of how this battle goes. It is open-ish country. It is ripe for armoured warfare, but lots of other things have got to be right as well. And remember, we're still in the spring. The ground is still soft. It won't be until the summer, when the ground gets hard and dusty, that tanks and armoured vehicles can spread out away from the roads and move forward. And if the Russians are still fighting that sort of battle in the summer, then they won't be doing terribly well. OK, well, another question about the battle for the Donbas. This one from Caroline, who says the war seems to have been a disaster from the start for Russia. Yeah. And now it seems Russia is struggling to take the Donbas region. If they fail to do this, do you think that will end the war? So if it ends up in stalemate, if the Ukrainians hold out, is that it? Mr. Putin is not going to lose gracefully. I think we can be sure about that. If this ends up in stalemate for the time being, then his only choice really is to mobilise. Remember that the Ukrainians are doing so well because they're fighting for their lives, they're fighting for their survival, and they're fully mobilised. Their economy is tanking because they're putting everything into this war. They're giving it everything. In Russia, this is still a special military operation. And, you can go to prison for 15 years for calling it a war. And President Putin obviously doesn't want to mobilise, to declare mobilisation, because that would look like outright failure. But unless he creates some form of mobilisation, he just doesn't have enough troops to go beyond a stalemate in the Donbas. Now, there's all sorts of quiet mobilisation that seems to be going on in Russia, which is causing some kickback, particularly in the cities of the east, where recruiting officers are beginning to call people in and tell them that they're being conscripted. They said, well, I wasn't conscripted in April. Why am I being conscripted now? So don't question it, just sign the forms. So there's a lot of that going on, and there's a lot of stuff leaking out that there are firebomb attacks on some recruiting officers and some government buildings in the eastern cities. We'll see where that goes. But I suppose what I'm saying is that if this gets to a stalemate in the summer or early autumn, then I think Putin will up the ante, both in terms of his the way in which he presents this war with the rest of Europe. This will be NATO helping the Ukrainians in ways that are completely unacceptable. And he will have to find more troops and more forces to put in. I mean, ultimately, Russia is so much bigger than Ukraine that if it mobilises, it can bring this very inefficient steamroller to bear. It is inefficient, it is old, and it's very badly commanded, but it is big. OK, well, we talked a lot about Russian deployment of resources. Jono's got a question now about the Ukrainians, and Jono asks, has Ukraine accepted the temporary loss of Kherson in order to prioritise the Donbas? Just give us a thumbnail sketch of the geography on the way to Odessa. Yes, I mean, Kherson is a very important city. It's the only city the Russians control, and they haven't controlled it very well because there's an awful lot of civil disorder there, and a lot of people are disappearing, I have to say. There's a sort of dark Gestapo night has descended on Kherson, which is extremely disturbing as the stories begin to come out. The Ukrainians were moving on it. They were saying a few weeks ago they thought they might even retake it. That was too optimistic. But they're there in the northwest of the city. They've pushed back from Mykolaiv. They are giving the Russians something else to think about in Kherson. So in a sense, they're fixing Russian forces in place so these forces can't disappear to the Donbas to help Putin in his other campaign. They haven't given up on Kherson, but to be honest, this whole war is now concentrating on what happens in the Donbas. And both sides are keeping what I think they feel are the minimum forces they can live with in some of the other areas. So Kherson is not, in my view, going to be liberated anytime soon, but the Ukrainians do have an optimistic scenario that they will get to liberate it before some other areas. OK, Michael, an awful lot to absorb from that. Much more to come. We're going to take a short break now, and you are watching a special question and answer programme about the war in Ukraine. Next, we're going to be asking and addressing, why is Russia allowed to blockade grain shipments
at Ukraine's ports. Stay with us to find out.
And this isn't really something that is new news to many of us, because it's something we've been documenting for a long time, be it disposable razors, cashmere jumpers or jeans. We've constantly monitored the fact that women do pay more. Now, when it's a like for like in men's and women's clothing, you'd actually expect men to be paying more, as generally the items contain more materials. But it's not as simple as that. And it's not as simple as just saying, well, it's a supply and demand thing, which is very much what drives it. We will generally pay more. But there is a risk element that businesses take on with us as females. We tend to have a lot more to choose from. Fashion drives a lot of our decisions. So the businesses say, well, this is a much riskier proposition in terms of trying to get it right. Certainly an element of supply and demand in it. If we will buy it, they will put those prices on it. And absolutely, that's how the world goes round. I think the fact is, though, we probably demand more from our shopping experience too. And I think there's lots of elements in terms of that risk factor that businesses have to take on. We're probably more likely to maybe buy a lot of items online and then return more. But the fact of the matter is, it just doesn't stack up when you are a female like me, like you, trying to buy something that is pretty much in equal territory. A pair of jeans, for instance, is a pair of jeans. And if we're paying 20% more, it just doesn't sit well. In today's day and age, where consumers are looking for clarity, consistency and authenticity from businesses, I think it might be time for some of these organisations to realise that consumers are probably going to start reacting to that.
Welcome back. As you know, I'm with Professor Michael Clarke, who's answering your questions about the current situation with the war in Ukraine. And Michael, we've been talking a lot about the south and the east. We're turning now to the north, where clearly, I mean, you know, the battle looks like it's been won, but it's not over, is it? And this question from Nigel asks, how much of a problem is the Belarus military deployment to the northern border of Ukraine? Will this impact their progress? And could the West intervene? So this is news of a very close Russian ally, of course, to the north of Kiev. They've pushed their troops up, have they?
They have, yes. I mean, second point first, no, the West won't intervene. This won't provoke Western intervention. And what the Belarusians have done is mobilised or pushed some of their troops in readiness up to the border. I'm pretty sure they won't go beyond the border. I mean, President Lukashenko has been a study in what I call the sort of diplomatic okey-cokey, in that first of all he was in, he's totally in, then he was completely out, then he's halfway in, now he's thinking, he's implying he might be in again. In reality, if he joins a failing campaign, then he may be out of office pretty soon. I mean, his domestic situation is pretty shaky and he needs Putin's support all the time. So I think what this is an attempt to do is to give the Ukrainians something else to worry about, to put a force right upon their northwest border that they have to consider. As a way, and I'm sure he hopes it will draw Ukrainian forces.
Well, does it tie up some of their forces that could be deployed to the Donbas?
It ties up, it ties up a screening force. But all they need is a screening force to actually, play a delaying role. And if the Belarusians were, foolish enough to go over the border, and Lukashenko really threw his lot in with Putin at a time when Putin's lot doesn't look very good, then the Ukrainians could redeploy. But it won't bring the West in. It just gives the Ukrainians a complicating factor. But if I was in Kiev, I wouldn't worry too much about this. You don't want to be complacent. But a screening force, I think, will probably do it. OK, well, let's talk more about borders, and this time the Ukrainian border with Russia. And, of course,
That's victory, it seems, around Kharkiv. Would it be wise for Ukraine to advance toward Belgorod into Russian territory to interrupt supplies, or would it be too risky militarily as well as politically? And haven't the Ukrainians always said, well, you've invaded us, we've never had any intention of invading you? So, I mean, presumably that would be part of that equation.
Yeah, and Ukraine's, the support Ukraine has around, throughout the Western world, in quite a lot of the rest of the world, quite a lot, not all, is based on the fact that they are completely blameless in this. They have no aggressive intent towards Russia. If they went over the border, then that would undermine that claim, even though there's a good military case for going over the border. Because if you look at an atlas, I was looking at some motoring atlases of this, there is only one motorway from Belgorod to Kharkiv, the E105, which is what the Russians have been using as their main supply route. The Ukrainians now threaten that E105. They can target it with artillery, they can target it with drones, they can use special forces to target it unattributably. And the Russians have now got to go quite a long way east. And there are no decent roads other than the E105 east of Belgorod. So the Russians have got real problems in supplying their forces in the Donbas, which they were supplying from Belgorod to Kharkiv, straight down to Izium in the south. That was an easy route for them, no longer. So the Ukrainians are already, as it were, playing havoc with Russian communications. And somebody keeps blowing up the railway line. So, they're already achieving what they would like to achieve. I'm sure they'd like to do more of it or have more of it done. But the fact is, far too politically risky to move outside their own borders.
OK, we've got another question now about Russian intentions and ambitions. This one from Matt, who asks, what does the Russian withdrawal from the Kiev region and bolstering of forces in the east of Ukraine suggest about the ultimate goal of Putin and Russia? And that is one that has everyone scratching their heads. What's enough for Putin? Yeah,
we don't really know. His ultimate goal is still, apparently, the abolition of Ukraine as an independent state. His argument is that Ukraine is not a genuine state. It's a sort of puppet government, effectively established by the West and used by Western Nazis and American imperialists as a way of pushing Russia, as a way of threatening Russia. That's still his view, and I'm fairly sure it is his sincere view. And so his ultimate aim is that Russia should simply take over Ukrainian territory as if it were the old Soviet Union, and Ukraine was just one big region within the old Soviet Union. However, since that hasn't gone very well, and he's now on his third strategy. The first strategy was grab Kiev and take over the government quickly. The second strategy was a maneuver strategy, grab the cities and take over the government that way. That didn't work. So the third strategy now is, well, let's go for some territory in the Donbas. That at least is the minimal requirement to protect our Russian ethnics and our Russian speakers in the Donbas. And it would give him something to negotiate with if this ends in a negotiation. And then he can, in his own mind, I think he can settle back. He won't be able to settle back, but in his own mind, he'll settle back, wait another few years and see where the situation goes. So I think, his immediate aim is get some negotiating power with territory. His ultimate aim seems to have been what it always was.
And what about negotiating power with an escalation? John addresses this question about chemical weapons. If they are deployed by Russia in Ukraine, does this change the West's stance of not getting involved on the ground? To borrow President Obama's dictum, is this a red line that would elicit a response?
Yeah. The West is very careful now not to talk about red lines in relation to this sort of chemical use, because if you can't enforce them, you shouldn't talk about them. If you establish a red line, you've got to know that you can enforce it and that you've got the political power and the political courage to do so. I think the answer to this question hasn't changed since the beginning of the war. If the Russians use chemical weapons, we will be even more outraged. Everything we are now doing, we will do more of and more determinedly, but that still, in my view, would not produce a Western response on the ground. So far, the red line that everyone agrees we should avoid is NATO and Russian troops fighting each other directly. And the Russians seem to accept that that's an important red line. We accept it's an important red line. So far, that's been the one red line that there is implicit, strong agreement to. And I don't think a use of chemical would actually cross that line.
OK, question, I suppose, about the economy and Ukraine and, of course, food supplies. Food supplies not just for Ukraine, but food supplies for the world. This from Stephanie. We understand grain shipments can't leave Ukraine. Why are Russia allowed to blockade ports? Surely neutral ships should be allowed safe passage and protected by the UN from interference. I suppose in a way that brings us back to not getting involved in conflict with the Russian Navy.
Yes. There's 25 million tonnes of grain tied up in Odessa, which is blockaded, 25 million tonnes. Normally they shift about 5 million tonnes a month. So there's 5 months' worth of grain, which has not gone anywhere so far, roughly. And there are at least 14 African countries and 4 or 5 Middle Eastern countries, not in Africa, who are dependent on Ukrainian grain in particular. About 400 million people are now seriously in need. And it's not only Ukrainian grain, it's the climate crisis, it's the COVID effect, it's the fuel energy price increases, which make all costs higher. There's a growing food crisis. This is another twist on that problem. One idea is that surely the United Nations could establish a sort of a corridor from Odessa, say, to Constanta in Romania, which can also handle bulk grain. It wouldn't be that far down the coast, just to another port on the Black Sea in Romania, in Constanta, and that actually could be UN supervised. But, should they be protected by the United Nations from interference? Well, who would do the protecting? The UN doesn't have a navy. The UN doesn't have any military forces of its own at all. So who would do the protecting? I was at a meeting earlier today with the former ambassador to Turkey, and he'd just come back from Turkey, and he was saying flying over the Bosphorus was interesting. He said, when you look down from the aircraft, normally both sides of the Bosphorus, this is the sea between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, of course, controlled by Turkey. He said, normally it is a maze of ships coming in, going out, queuing up to get in, queuing up to get out. He said there's almost nothing there. He said the Bosphorus, he said, is almost deserted at the moment because no one will go there. And the point was made that a lot of ships can't get insurance to go into the Black Sea. So even if they're on innocent passage, they can't get the insurance.
And that's going to have a long-term effect. Michael, time to draw breath again. Lots more to come. You're watching a special question and answer programme about the war in Ukraine. And next we're going to be asking if Turkey vetoes Finland and Sweden joining NATO, will it weaken the united response of that military alliance? Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm with Professor Michael Clarke answering your questions about the war in Ukraine. Right, Michael, coming up now, lots of questions about NATO and, of course, its expansion with the applications by Sweden and Finland. This from Alex saying, if Turkey was to veto Finland and Sweden joining NATO, could it weaken the united response of NATO and, even if it is only symbolic, empower Putin? Because we know Turkey have voiced objections.
Yes, I mean, if Sweden and Finland don't get into NATO for some reason now, it would be a huge blow, political blow to NATO. It would be a massive step backwards in everything that Europe has stood for since the 24th of February. And it would be, absolutely right, it would be a great victory for President Putin. And for that reason, he is believed to be in close contact with President Erdogan of Turkey to talk to him about the possibilities. But, there's lots we could say about the Turkish position on this and Erdogan's own thinking. But essentially, yes, if this doesn't happen, then NATO will have taken quite a backward step.
Well, to address that, good question now from Ben, suggesting perhaps the removal of Turkey. Could NATO remove Turkey and then take in Sweden and Finland? It seems they'd be more in line with Western values and military strength. I mean, because that's the point, isn't it? I mean, Turkey's faced both ways, hasn't it, in terms of NATO?
Yes,
it's got Russian weaponry and then supplied drones to the Ukrainians.
Exactly, and it's worked with the Russians on some issues and against them on others. I mean, Erdogan is his own man, that's the point. We've sometimes wondered, what have you got to do to get thrown out of NATO? How bad do you have to be? How bad an ally do you have to be? But the fact is, there's no mechanism for throwing anybody out. The Washington Treaty doesn't allow for the expulsion of any country. We used to joke at one time that we ought to make it like the Premiership, that every 5 years we should vote on who has been the least NATO-esque member and throw them out and bring in somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. But the French, what did they do? Did they just prorogue their membership under de Gaulle?
Well, they left the treaty organisation, but stayed in the treaty. That was in 1966, and that was when NATO was based in Paris. And so the whole of the operation had to move out to Brussels. And de Gaulle famously said, well, of course, we're a member of the North Atlantic Treaty, but we're not a member of this organisation. And it did the French military immense harm, because it meant that whenever something did come up, like the Gulf War in 1991, nobody could work with them. They were completely isolated because they didn't do the things, they didn't operate in the way that NATO operated.
And I suppose the other issue about kicking Turkey out, if you could, would be, well, whose orbit would they end up in?
Exactly, yeah. Nobody's going to kick Turkey out. And the point is, nobody has ever left NATO. And remember, NATO is an organisation that has only ever responded to people wanting to join it. This idea that is put around, certainly in Russian circles and with some lines here, that NATO enlargement, NATO expansion is the problem. NATO has only ever reacted to other people being desperate to get in. And one of the reasons they're desperate to get in is because they want the United States guarantee. They want to know that Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, includes their involvement in this United States-based guarantee. And they want the security of being inside the camp. And now even, Sweden, that's been neutral since 1812, and Finland, neutral since 1945, even they now want to come inside the camp.
Interesting question from Mike on this, on the issue of the Russian response. And that change in language, or was it? Oh, interesting to get your take. Here's the question. Russia's tone of threats has changed. Is this a matter of not wanting to provoke NATO further, or could this be a way of diverting NATO's attention to build forces at the Finnish border? And this was the comments yesterday from President Putin, said he didn't really have a problem if Finland and Sweden joined.
Well, I think he's trying to save his dignity here because, this whole crisis, he said, began because Ukraine was being manipulated by NATO that was constantly threatening Russia by enlarging and expanding. And remember, to put myself in his position for a moment, NATO has enlarged itself since 1949 9 times. 9 times. It started off with 12 members. It's now got 30. It's about to get 32. So it's getting towards 3 times the size that it was when it began. And of those 9 enlargements, 6 of them have taken place while President Putin's been in power. So he's sat in the Kremlin and he's seen NATO's borders come 1,000 miles nearer to Moscow. And he thinks in very territorial terms. He's not a very subtle man. He's not a subtle thinker. That's what he sees. And so I think he was furious about this idea that Finland and Sweden should join NATO. It's a massive political failure on his part, strategic failure. It's a massive strategic failure. And I think he's trying to rescue a bit of his dignity by saying, oh, it's no big deal. It's a huge deal. It's a major deal.
OK, let's move away from NATO, enlargement or not. Jerry's question, one I suppose a lot of people are asking, but I'm not sure, even if you did know, how much you're able to tell us about this. Jerry's question is this: how is the MOD operating its intelligence in Ukraine to be providing daily intel reports on Russian strength, advances and setbacks? I mean, we do get that daily assessment from the MOD. As I say, how much of the intelligence gathering methodology are you able to tell us about?
Yeah, well, I mean, that comes from Defence Intelligence, which is one of the agencies. So our big agencies are MI5, Internal Intelligence, MI6, Foreign Intelligence, GCHQ, Signals Intelligence, and Defence Intelligence, which is all the intelligence that the armed forces bring together. So that's our intelligence arm. The point is that our intelligence, along with American intelligence together, particularly with GCHQ and the National Intelligence Agency in the States, are far and away the most powerful intelligence engines in the world. There's nobody to touch them. Britain and America working together are easily the most powerful intelligence organisation on the planet, you know, working with the Americans. So, I mean, are we giving the Ukrainians? Yeah, you bet we are. I believe nobody.
Well, we heard that from the Americans.
Yes,
over the weekend we found out that they're able to, very quickly to get in touch with Ukrainian forces on the ground and pinpoint target some of the Russian movements.
That's right. Well, I mean, they've had 11 generals killed in action, and that doesn't happen unless somebody's got. I mean, unless the Ukrainians are extraordinarily lucky. They're getting some quite good information. Now, the point is that intelligence. I mean, I can talk about this because I'm just an analyst. I'm nobody, but. The intelligence agencies themselves just keep quiet about it. You know, if you're doing a good job, then the less you say about it, the more you'll be able to continue to do a good job. So, what we do know, and what is in the public domain, of course, is that the aerial intelligence is still pretty good. You've got NATO aircraft flying all the way around Ukrainian airspace, all the way around the edges of Ukrainian airspace, all the time, looking at what Russian forces are doing, and Belarusian forces, and that's coming back more or less in real time. So Ukraine is getting that. They've got a very good software system themselves. The Ukrainians have got secure communications, mainly thanks to Elon Musk, who's put his Starlink satellites above Ukraine. Good job. And so they've got these secure communications that the Russians can't really break into. So the Ukrainians have got a lot of advantages. And, I mean, Britain never comments on whether we have special forces in Ukraine. I don't know. I'd be very surprised if we didn't. And the whole point about special forces is not that they go to fight. Special forces, SAS and SBS and so on, I mean, they can visit paralysing violence on the Queen's enemies if they need to. But their job is simply to be reconnaissance, is to exist in any environment, in small groups or even singly, and just sit there and observe, to sit there as a recon asset. And that's the point. They can survive. They're completely self-sufficient. You don't have to worry about them. That's what makes them special is their ability not to fight, but to survive. And I'd be very surprised if there weren't some special forces operating on behalf of the Ukrainians. I don't know, but I'd be surprised if we didn't.
Fascinating thoughts, Michael. Well, let's talk about what we do know in terms of UK and others' aid to Ukraine. And Dawn asks this. The UK and most of the rest of the world have provided arms and aid to Ukraine in its billions. Has the amount of military equipment provided to Ukraine left the UK less able to defend itself and other countries? I mean, you can't manufacture this stuff, in a couple of weeks, can you?
No, that's right. The shares in all of the big arms companies like British Aerospace, who do a lot of different sorts of arms. I mean, they've basically absorbed most of the old British ordnance industry. Shares in Thales, for instance, who manufacture in Northern Ireland. Saab, who produce the NLAW missiles but manufacture in Northern Ireland. Same with Javelin and so on. So we gave the Ukrainians all of our supply of NLAWs, which are these anti-tank, the new lightweight anti-tank weapon. And those are NLAWs on the screen, I think, in their cases. Mm-hmm. So we gave them our whole supply of NLAWs, and Ben Wallace was asked about this, and he said, well, it doesn't matter. We'll get more. But the companies are ramping up. Britain has basically given away most of its light weapons. So NLAWs, Javelin, Starstreak, which is, again, another very good anti-aircraft system, much more sophisticated. We've given them as many of those, I think, as we've got. And we are giving some armoured vehicles, not armour not tank armour, but Mastiff and maybe Jackal vehicles that we used in Afghanistan, which are mine-resistant and protect troops. So the battlefield taxis, basically, for troops. So we're doing that. Personally, I don't know why we don't give them our Warrior fighting vehicle. That's sort of a very light tank, in effect, because we say we're going to phase the Warriors out in favour of this Ajax vehicle, as and when we get it. Big issues there. But, I mean, if we're phasing Warrior out, why don't we give them Warrior? They are very effective on the battlefield. But that's just my idea. So, is Britain leaving its self-defence? No. But it means that the companies are ramping up the resupply, and this is all costing quite a lot of money. Not, I think, coming out of the defence budget. This, I think, comes out of the Treasury Contingency Reserve, which is special circumstance. This is a war, happens to be somebody else's war, but we need to take this from national accounts, not lump this onto defence. OK, well, that's the hardware. Now let's end this section with a question about the personnel. Sean asks, in terms of personnel, how long is the conflict realistically sustainable for, in the view of both sides? Now, we know we have an estimate of the Russian losses. We don't really know what's going on with the Ukrainians. No, I mean, the Russians, we know, are fairly confident. They've lost about a third of their force, about 60,000 out of 180, 190. They can't keep on doing that because their standing army, remember, this is not a mobilised country. This is a special military operation. Their standing army is 280,000. And every year, April, another 130,000 come in as conscripts and 130,000 leave. So at any given moment, that army is in the process of rotation. And the conscripts come in, they do literally 5 or 6 months training, sometimes 7 months training, which only leaves them 5 months to do anything soldierly before they are entitled to go again. So the Russians are actually pretty short. Now, Ukraine has an army of 125,000, smaller, but they have reserves of 900,000, of whom a third, 300,000 or more, have fought in the Donbas sometime in the last 8 years because of the situation after 2014. So the Ukrainians can put an army in the field of about 400,000, plus their territorial defence force, which stands at the moment at about 160,000, and the Ukrainians say, we can put 1 million people under arms, and I believe them. If this war goes on, that's the irony of this. The longer this goes on, the more the Russians will find themselves outgunned because of Western systems that the Ukrainians are using and outnumbered by the people that the Ukrainians can put in the field, unless the Russians mobilise. If they don't mobilise, then they get outgunned and outnumbered. That's Putin's problem. What a thought to end this section on. Our last section coming up. You're watching a special question and answer programme about the war in Ukraine. So next we're asking, what is the most likely way this war will end now? Stay with us.
Moving this way.
And over there is Dover.
We track the changes happening to our world right now.
I think it's a procession of the Taliban. There they are, right here.
Would you, as Prime Minister, be able to look them in the face?
Let's have a look at both of those two things.
I just want to say thank you for having the courage to speak to us.
We do genuinely believe in what we do, to show the truth.
I thought there was an astonishing story there.
They have breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders, and now they're going to be arrested.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Welcome back. As you know by now, I'm with Professor Michael Clarke and your questions about the war in Ukraine. OK, Michael, let's dive in for this last section and I suppose looking at any potential endgame. This from Mike saying, is it realistic to think Ukraine has the military capability to restore its pre-2014 borders? That's what we hear all the time from Ukraine, from President Zelensky. Yeah. Does he have to say that, or does he really think they can do that? Throw the Russians out of Crimea?
He has to say it. Because he's standing for Ukrainian sovereignty, which was breached in 2014 and again twice in 2014 and again in 2022. So, yes, he has to say it. If there is to be some sort of negotiation at the end of this, I mean, I do think the Ukrainians, if they're prepared to keep fighting and if the West is prepared to keep supplying and if Putin doesn't mobilise sufficiently, then I think, yes, the Ukrainians can push the Russians eventually back out of their borders. But Crimea, as you say, is a different issue. I mean, Crimea was Russian for 200 years. It only became Ukrainian in 1953. Stalin, as it were, allocated it to Ukraine. And ethnically, historically, spiritually, most of Crimea is actually Russian. So I think that the Ukrainians, they know that, and Zelensky must know that. If it comes to some grand negotiation at the end of the year or next year, what I think Zelensky would like to say is, look, leave my territory. I will give you. We'll stop worrying about Crimea. You can keep Crimea because, you know, basically we don't want it. We'd love it, but we can't. You can keep Crimea, and that is my major, huge concession. So take it and be grateful, and get out of my territory everywhere else. Now, can they achieve that militarily? Not at the moment. But as I say, if they keep fighting, if the West keeps supplying, then I think there's a 50-50 chance that that's where the Ukrainians might be. It's certainly where they think they will be, and their morale is sky high at the moment.
Indeed. OK, well, if there is a grand negotiation, as you put it, Michael, how much of a factor would Edwina's question be in this? How will the Russian government and Putin be held to account for war crimes against Ukraine? And we know the view from Paris, for instance, is that, you don't need to pursue these issues too hard. You have to give Russia some kind of, well, perhaps not a victory, but some kind of way out.
Maybe, but war crimes are a very live issue in this conflict. And it's the first conflict that I can think of in my lifetime, or ever for that matter, where war crimes have been on the agenda from day one and evidence has been accumulating because of modern technology. And so this evidence is archived. It's not going to go away. It'll be there effectively forever. And there are different forums. So there's the International Court of Justice in the UN, which is only state to state. There's the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is the one everyone looks at, which has jurisdiction just about in Ukraine, because Ukraine is not part of the ICC, but as I said, it will accept the jurisdiction. And then there's the possibility of an ad hoc court. There was an ad hoc court for former Yugoslavia, there was one for Sierra Leone, there was one for Rwanda. So they do exist, and Gordon Brown, amongst others, has said we need a special tribunal to deal with this. So it can happen. The wheels of international justice do turn very slowly, but they do turn.
But they have a long arm.
That's the point.
Well, I mean, for Putin, you said this before on these programmes, Michael, if Putin is to face that kind of reckoning, then presumably he has to be out of power. Let's put Ben's question to you. Are we seeing the start of Putin's demise with apparent unrest in Russia growing? You mentioned those attacks on recruitment offices, for instance. What evidence are we seeing? Well,
not in the broader population. We see evidence of some disquiet, and some of it's come out on media, actually Russian media. Some of the mainstream media have started to discuss some of the things that are going wrong. And one or two commentators are saying, we've got ex-military commentators, interestingly, are saying we've got to be realistic about this. And so there is that sense of realism is seeping in, even to this very controlled environment. But ultimately, the general population may become more discontented, but there's a rally around the flag effect, and that's what you'd expect. Putin is still pretty popular, except I think that popularity is probably rather fragile, maybe rather brittle. We are still saying, I'm still saying for sure, that if there is to be a revolt against Putin, it's got to come from the military and the Siloviki, who are the security people. So the FSB, who, the old KGB, the SVR, and the GRU, the military intelligence. Because these are the people who are being blamed. They've been asked to do the impossible, and Putin is blaming them for failing to do the impossible. And ultimately, their only defence mechanism will actually be to turn on him. Now, as and when that happens, we don't know. But unless he can keep suppressing this blame culture, unless he can find either somebody else to blame or somehow get them on board with him for this failing campaign, he's got real problems. Real problems.
OK, John asks this. Is a peace deal in Ukraine likely to be reached soon now that there is a stalemate? Well, is there a stalemate? There certainly aren't any negotiations, really substantial negotiations taking place, are there?
There's not a stalemate yet. I mean, the fact that the front is not moving forward very far in the Donbas doesn't mean there's a stalemate. It's a bit like, I love cricket. It's a bit like watching cricket, where for a couple of hours, not very much seems to happen, and then everything happens. And, that old Lenin phrase that, nothing happens for decades, then decades happen in days. Yeah. And I still think that's where we are in this war. There's a lot happening beneath the surface. It's not a stalemate. And to be honest, any peace deal will depend on the Ukrainians. If they feel that they want to go into negotiations, then the West will support them. I'm pretty sure, well, we have to. Yeah. If they don't want to go into peace negotiations, we support that too, because as far as we're concerned, they are fighting for their lives against unprovoked aggression, which is a threat to the liberal world order that we are part of. So they're fighting for us. And for that reason, we have no choice, really, but to stand behind the decisions that the Ukrainian government makes.
Well, let's put a full stop to this discussion. We're nearly out of time. Through David's question, and what are your thoughts, Michael? What is the most likely way this war will end now? Or will it end now?
Yeah, I don't think it won't end now. It won't end for some time. And when it does end, it'll be more dangerous before it ends. I think we're at a phase now in the war when, because of what I said about Mr. Putin, I think he's actually got to start to mobilise in some way. The only way he can mobilise politically is to blame everything on the West and to say this is not a war about Ukraine, this is a war against the West. This is a war to preserve us against Western encroachments, which may mean that he might try to create false flag incidents to indicate encroachments, say in the Baltics or in Moldova or wherever.
So is that why you say it's more dangerous now when, we've seen what's happened around Kiev, Kharkiv, because people are beginning to think, well,
because Putin won't lose gracefully, that's the point. He won't be pragmatic enough just to withdraw and try and... If he withdraws and tries to spin it up, then his political career is probably over. And so he's only got one direction. He has to keep going forward, which is why I think this war will become more dangerous before it ends. So this is the time for strong nerves in the West. Applauding and cheering on the sidelines with Ukraine won't get us out of the problem. We've got to be very resolute and we've got to keep our nerve.
OK, Michael, thank you very much indeed once again. I mean, that really is so much food for thought, so much to digest. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your expertise with us. Professor Michael Clarke there, security and defence analyst, asking your questions about the war in Ukraine.